Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Barnes of the Honors College at the University of Houston, and I am very much looking forward to our course together, a 6-week deep dive into Homer's Odyssey at the Women's Institute of Houston. This presentation today, this thing you're looking at and listening to, is designed to be a brief-ish introduction to Homer and the Odyssey, the subject of our course. The idea is that this introduction will help you be better equipped to begin reading the first 4 books of the Odyssey, which we'll be talking about in depth in our first in-person meeting, which is on Monday, March 25th. The course will tackle 4 books per meeting. So, for example, we'll begin with books 1 through 4 on March 25th, and then on April 1st, we'll discuss books 5 through 8. On April 8th, we'll discuss books 9 through 12, and so on. So 4 books at a time. By the way, you'll notice that I'm saying books. The Odyssey is divided into 24 parts, which are not called chapters, but books. Just want to be clear about that from the outset. The assumption behind this pre-recorded introduction is that when you come to class on March 25th, you will have already read books 1 through 4 of the Odyssey in Emily Wilson's recent and just outstanding translation. But I know from decades of teaching the Odyssey that just plunging cold into the first 4 books can present some challenges, especially but not only for first-time readers of the poem. First and foremost, the poem assumes that you know, as its original ancient Greek audience would have known, a great deal of mythological background. It assumes, in fact, that you are already familiar with the entire story of Odysseus. And perhaps you've read the Odyssey before, and or you know your Greek myths very well. I know for a fact that some of you do. But if you don't, or if you need a refresher, in a few minutes I'll walk you through the essential background that you need to know to start in on the poem with confidence. So that's very much the goal here, to give you the basic tools you need to start working your way through the Odyssey, while still leaving enough room for the poem itself to tell you what it wants to tell you in its own way. Right? For instance, while I'm going to give you a good bit of background about Odysseus, the main character of the Odyssey, I'm not going to talk in this presentation about his characteristics, his personality, his qualities as a hero. I'm going to let the poem do that as we read it together. And one more thing before we get into it. This is the translation we'll be using for the class. It's the translation I'm asking you to read, and it's the only one that I'll be teaching from. There are dozens of easily available translations of the Odyssey out there, all of them different from one another. So please make sure that this translation is the one you're reading and bringing to class with you. When we refer to page numbers in class, for example, we want to make sure that we are all literally on the same page. The translation is only a few years old. It is by a classic scholar named Emily Wilson, seen here. Emily Wilson is, by the way, the first woman to ever publish a translation of the Odyssey. And her translation is eminently clear and readable, just like the Greek original. Okay, so let's start with the title and our author. The Odyssey is a long epic poem from ancient Greece. And the title, in its Greek form, simply means story about Odysseus. That's what the Odyssey, or in Greek, Odysseia, means. Story about Odysseus. Odysseus is the main character, and the heart of the plot of the Odyssey is his long and winding return to his home island of Ithaca after the Trojan War. More on the Trojan War in just a bit. The author's name is Homer, And if we ask the question, who was Homer? The short answer is we don't know. We just don't know. What we do know is that the written poems attributed to Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the one we're reading, are the end result of a long oral performance tradition in ancient Greece. Ancient Greece, which corresponds roughly to this area. Notice that this ancient territory is not the same as the borders of the modern nation state of Greece. The Odyssey is the end result of centuries of people performing the story or parts of the story of the return of Odysseus to audiences of listeners. And these performances, in front of these audiences of listeners, they were not readings. They were done without a script, for the simple reason that they were already taking place well before the creation of the Greek alphabet, during that long time in not just Mediterranean history, but human history, when all stories and all knowledge was communicated and passed down orally. In the long view of the history of human beings, writing, in fact, is still a very new technology. So, for centuries and centuries, the story of the Odyssey circulated orally throughout the Greek-speaking world, along with other stories that we now call myths. This is the origin of Greek mythology. Until, at some point, a long, complex, and richly detailed version of the return of Odysseus was written down, giving us the poem that we have today. When exactly that happened, that writing down, and where, and why, we also don't know for sure, and we most likely never will. But most scholars agree that this long, monumental version of the Odyssey was written down not long after the invention of the Greek alphabet, which we can date to right around 700 BC, that is, 2,700 years ago. And at that point, upon its being written down, it was already attributed to some great poet named Homer. There was plenty of later speculation in the ancient world about who this Homer was, but no firm evidence for his identity has made its way down to us. And not just us. Ancient Greek authors themselves, including the philosophers Plato and Aristotle, did not know anything certain about this Homer either. Some said that he was from the town of Smyrna, now Izmir, in Asia Minor. Others that he was from the island of Chios. Most said that he was blind, but all of this is just the reporting of old and often contradictory traditions. Whoever Homer was, he is now lost to us in the mists of prehistory. This bust you see here is a work of the imagination. It dates from the 2nd century AD. It's a Roman copy of an earlier Greek original. And it's a kind of fantasy idea of what Homer, blind, old, wise, the best of the best poets, might have looked like. But again, what we do know is that over the centuries of oral performance that stand behind this written version of the Odyssey, performers, like this one from the 5th century BC, those performers developed a special poetic rhythm and language and storytelling techniques and habits that they used when they performed the story to do so in the most effective and entertaining way possible. The Odyssey is, for us, now, a text that we read, but it was originally meant to be performed and to be heard. You can resurrect this tradition by reading the poem out loud to yourself or your partner or your pet or whoever, whether they want you to or not. If you do that, or when you do that, right, keep two things in mind. One, what you are reading is, of course, a translation into English. The real Odyssey is in ancient Greek. It looks like this. It does not sound much like the Greek that is spoken today, right? This is 2,700 years ago. And second, that this is poetry. It has a traditional meter, a traditional rhythm, with all sorts of possible variations to keep it lively and prevent it from becoming monotonous. As for what it sounded like, well, it was typically performed, as you see in that image on the left, to the accompaniment of a stringed instrument. I don't have a lyre with me, couldn't play it if I did, but I will exaggerate in a few spots so that you can hear the rhythm of the verse. And so the first 10 lines of the Odyssey would have sounded, in ancient Greek, something like this. Andra moen epemusa polutropon hosmala pola plankthe, petroies hieromptoliethron perse. Pallon danthropon idenaste akaino onegno, polad hogen panto pathenalge ahon katathumon. Ornumenos hen te psuken kai noston hetairon. Alur hos hetaruse rusatohi yemenosper, auton gas veteresin atastaliesinolonto, nepioi, hoi katabus huperionos eilioio estion. Autarho toisen afeleto nostimonemar, ton hamothengethea, thugaterdios, epekahemen. Hopefully you can hear that rhythm. That's the meter, the flow in which these singers performed their stories. Our English translation by Emily Wilson is poetry too, and it has a rhythm of its own, with 5 stresses or beats per line. Again, read it out loud sometime and listen for it. Now, there's a lot more I could say about how Homeric poetry works as a result of its oral, traditional background, but let's move on to what's actually happening in the poem. So, the Odyssey takes place against a mythological backdrop that the poem assumes you're already familiar with. So let me give you some backstory. The main event that looms in the mythological background of the Odyssey is the Trojan War. The Trojan War was sparked when Paris, one of the princes of the powerful city of Troy, arrives in Sparta, which is in southern mainland Greece. I'll show you on a map in a bit. So Paris arrives in Sparta and is welcomed as an honored guest in the palace of Menelaus and Helen, the ruling king and queen of Sparta. Helen, I should say, whose father is the god Zeus himself, is reputed to be the most beautiful woman in the world. While Paris is there in Sparta, the king, Menelaus, is called away on urgent business. And while he is gone, Paris and Queen Helen become lovers and run away together for Troy. Menelaus returns to Sparta to find his wife is missing and realizes what has happened. And so, Menelaus appeals to the most powerful of all the Greek kings, his own brother Agamemnon, who has a kingdom up in Argos. Agamemnon rounds up the most powerful heroes from all over the Greek world, and in time, a massive Greek fleet, with Agamemnon as its commander, sails to Troy to force the Trojans to return Helen, and if that's what it takes, to seize and plunder Troy as well. Troy was famously wealthy. Among the many famous Greek heroes at Troy are, in addition to Agamemnon and Menelaus, Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greeks, and Nestor, an older man respected for his experience, wisdom, and advice. I mention these heroes in particular, Menelaus, Agamemnon, Achilles, and Nestor, because you are going to meet them all as the poem goes on. In fact, you'll meet Nestor in Book 3, in his hometown of Pylos, and Menelaus and Helen in Book 4, there in Sparta. You'll meet the ghosts of Agamemnon and Achilles in Books 11 and 24. And of course, among these Greek heroes at Troy is our man, Odysseus, who leaves his home island of Ithaca just after his son Telemachus is born. Now, here's a map to help us orient ourselves. Okay, Troy is up there in the top right, in what is now modern-day Turkey. Moving down to the left, there is Ithaca, the small, rugged, hardscrabble home island of Odysseus, right? Ithaca. Moving south, Pylos, in the south of what we call the Peloponnese in Greece, is the hometown of Nestor. We'll arrive there in Book 3. Heading east or right is Sparta, home of Menelaus and Helen, both before the war and, very awkwardly, after the war. We'll be there in Book 4. And north of Sparta, last, is Argos. We don't visit Argos in the Odyssey, but it might be helpful since I've mentioned it to know where it is. That is the home base of the great king Agamemnon. Okay. The Trojan War lasts 10 full years. Homer's other epic poem, the Iliad, centers on the hero Achilles and recounts a famous episode that occurs in the last year of the Trojan War. So the events of the Iliad, if any of you have read that poem, occur before the events of the Odyssey. Now, many heroes on both sides, Greek and Trojan, die during the Trojan War, including Paris, who sparked the war, and Achilles, the greatest of the Greek heroes. And in the end, the Greeks resort to a supreme piece of deception, the great horse, in order to bring the city of Troy down. And that horse, the Trojan horse, as we know it now, that horse, by the way, is Odysseus's idea. Odysseus is, more than any other Greek warrior, a master of strategy and deception. Now, to make a long story short, the Trojans believe that the horse is an offering to the gods, and so they bring it into their city. All the other Greeks have left, and they find this horse abandoned on the beach. They understand that it's an offering to the gods, and thus it would be a sacrilege to, say, push it off a cliff or burn it. The best thing to do, the pious thing to do, would be to bring it into the city, both to protect something made in honor of the gods and as a victory monument at the end of a long 10-year war against the invading Greeks. What they don't know, of course, is that that horse is hollow and packed with Greek warriors, including Odysseus himself. In Book 4 of the Odyssey, Menelaus will tell us a vivid story about what it was like being packed inside the Trojan horse with Odysseus. He's in there too. Not only that, but the entire Greek fleet has not actually sailed home, as the Trojans thought, but is hidden just behind a nearby island, waiting for a signal. Troy is taken by surprise that night. After a long celebration, a victory celebration that turns out to be fatally wrong, the heroes climb out of the horse, a signal is sent, the ships rush to the beach, the Greeks flood in, and the Trojan people are massacred and the city looted and burned. Odysseus himself is leaving with a great deal of treasure that he and his men looted from Troy. And in Book 3, we'll hear firsthand from Nestor, the old man Nestor, about what happened after that, about the surviving Greek heroes' return home from Troy, filled with loot taken from the city, along with all the surviving members of their armies. Now, that is all background to the Odyssey. When the Odyssey starts, in Book 1, the Trojan War has already been over for 10 years. But the shadow of the Trojan War looms over the entire poem. There are references to it everywhere, from beginning to end. Many characters, including Odysseus himself, are still, despite the fact that they were ultimately victorious in the war, they are still coming to grips with the pain and the suffering and the loss they experienced over those 10 years at Troy. As for Odysseus himself, when the Odyssey begins, he has still not returned home from the war. Keep in mind, Odysseus left Ithaca for a war that ended up lasting 10 years. And it's been another 10 years since then, and Odysseus has not yet returned to Ithaca. He has been gone from his home for 20 years. He and his wife Penelope were newlyweds when he left Ithaca. Their son, Telemachus, was a newborn. Now, as the Odyssey begins, Telemachus is 20 years old, and he has never known his father. He has only heard stories. The tension of the first 4 books of the Odyssey is generated by the fact that Odysseus, king of Ithaca, survivor of Troy, is missing and presumed dead. No one seems to know what happened to him after he left Troy. The story of the Odyssey as a whole is the story of how Odysseus finally makes it home after 20 years and what happens when he arrives. Now, stories like this about the returns of the Greek heroes from Troy were also famous in their own right in antiquity. And the two most famous of these return stories are, well, the poem you're about to start reading, the Odyssey, The Return of Odysseus, and second, just as famous, almost just as famous, The Return of the Great King Agamemnon. You remember him from 5 minutes ago? He was Menelaus' brother, and as the richest and most powerful of the Greek kings, he was the leader of the entire Greek expedition against Troy. Agamemnon survives the Trojan War, and he returns home in triumph, but only to find treachery in his kingdom. As Nestor will tell us in Book 3, on pages 143 to 145, while Agamemnon was gone, his wife, Queen Clytemnestra, had taken a man named Aegisthus as her lover. So when Agamemnon finally returns home, victorious after 10 years of war at Troy, in what should have been his finest hour, at the homecoming feast in his own palace, he is murdered by Aegisthus and his men with the help of Clytemnestra. In some versions of the story, Agamemnon is killed by Clytemnestra herself. That's the inspiration for the painting you see by John Collier on the right. But Agamemnon's death is avenged. Agamemnon and Clytemnestra's son, Orestes, who has grown up away from home for reasons that are just too complicated to get into, eventually reaches young adulthood. And when he does, he returns home to kill Aegisthus and avenge the murder of his father. He also famously slays his mother, Clytemnestra, as well. This aspect is downplayed in the Odyssey. Now, this revenge of Orestes upon Aegisthus, the man who killed his father, Agamemnon, this happens a couple of years before the Odyssey begins. And why am I telling you all this? Because the story of Orestes' return and the justice of his vengeance upon Aegisthus, the man who killed his father, is a hot topic of conversation throughout books 1 through 4 of the Odyssey. In fact, the very first bit of dialogue in the entire poem, the conversation between the two gods Zeus and Athena on Mount Olympus early in Book 1, this is on page 106, is about how shameless Aegisthus was in killing the triumphant king and stealing his position, and how glorious Orestes now is because he has taken proper revenge upon the man who killed his father. Even the gods are talking about it. Later, in Book 1, Athena, a goddess who, as you will see, is looking out for both Odysseus and his son Telemachus, holds Orestes up as a model for Telemachus to emulate. Athena, in disguise, says to Telemachus there on page 114, "You must not stick to childhood. You are no longer just a little boy. You surely heard how everybody praised Orestes when he killed the man who killed his famous father, devious Aegisthus. Dear boy, I see how big and tall you are. Be brave and win yourself a lasting name." In other words, be like Orestes. And in Book 3, Telemachus himself says to Nestor, "Yes, Orestes took revenge. The Greeks will make him famous throughout the world and into future times." Like these. "I wish the gods would grant me that much power against those men who threaten and insult me, those cruel suitors." More on them in a bit. So, in these first few books of the Odyssey, and elsewhere in the poem, we are invited to keep thinking about the outcome of Agamemnon's return home and compare it to the situation on Ithaca, Odysseus' home island. And honestly, it's less like we're invited to keep thinking about it than that we're given no choice but to think about it because it keeps coming up. Here is a list of the references to the fates of Agamemnon and Aegisthus just in these first 4 books. I've underlined the 2 most detailed accounts. So this story of the return and death of Agamemnon at the hands of Aegisthus and Agamemnon's wife Clytemnestra, and the vengeance taken by Orestes, their son, upon Aegisthus. Right? This story is obviously important. Homer wouldn't keep bringing it up over and over if it weren't. But how? Well, think about a parallel here. On Ithaca, we have Odysseus, who, like Agamemnon, is a king, a husband, and a father, returning home from the Trojan War. Penelope is a queen, wife, and mother waiting at home, a woman who, like Clytemnestra, is, as you'll discover, renowned for her cunning and her shrewdness. We also have the so-called suitors, the threat to Odysseus' household, who all want to replace Odysseus as Penelope's husband, like Aegisthus replaced Agamemnon as king of Argos. And finally, the son, Telemachus, whom Athena urges to grow up and gain fame for himself like Orestes did, by finding a way to avenge himself on the men who are destroying his home. There are differences, of course, but the similarity in the situations and the roles here is notable. Agamemnon was one of the first Greeks to arrive home from the Trojan War, and Odysseus is the last. But right from the start, the Odyssey raises the grim possibility that Odysseus too will encounter trouble on his homecoming, especially if his wife Penelope gives in and accepts a new husband like Clytemnestra did. So, our characters, the returning king, the waiting queen under pressure, the enemy at home, the son looking for vengeance, they all have in the Odyssey their reflections in the dark mirror of this other story. And they present to us the possibility that Odysseus could meet the same bloody fate as Agamemnon when he finally returns home. Finally, a word about what's happening on Ithaca as the poem begins. This is clear enough, I think, in the poem itself, but it's one of those things that it might be helpful to know about in advance as you begin your reading. The situation on Ithaca, as the Odyssey begins, is, in a word, bad. In Odysseus' absence, and remember, it's been 20 years since he left for Troy, and no one by now knows what has become of him. In Odysseus' absence, dozens and dozens and dozens, over 100, local aristocrats As a group, they are called in English by the rather old-fashioned word suitors. They are making their suit to Penelope, right? These aristocratic suitors have assumed that after so many years, Odysseus must be dead somewhere, and so his kingdom and his wife Penelope are there for the taking. Telemachus, Odysseus and Penelope's son, should be Odysseus' successor, but he's in a weak position, outnumbered with, as he himself admits in Book 2, no experience in combat. As he says on page 122, there is no man to save the house, no man like him, Odysseus. I cannot fight against the suitors. I'd be useless. I've had no training. He has had no warrior father to train him. That's the work Odysseus would have done. The suitors, for their part, as one of them says outright, are not afraid of anybody. In Book 2 on page 126, one of the suitors says, "We are not afraid of anyone, much less this boy," he's talking about Telemachus, "with his long speeches. His house will be devoured, and payback will never come." And so, the suitors have been living as a gang in Odysseus' palace for over 3 years now, eating and drinking what doesn't belong to them, shouting down anyone who opposes them, and pressuring Penelope to choose one of them to be the new king of Ithaca. As for other questions, the role of the gods, for example, particularly Athena, the characters of Penelope and Telemachus, and much more, well, the poem itself is the best introduction. And in any case, I'll have much more to say, and I'll be very eager to hear what you have to say and answer any questions you may have when we meet to talk about books 1 through 4 on Monday the 25th. Until then, enjoy this picture of Odysseus' home island of Ithaca, and enjoy books 1 through 4 of the Odyssey. See you on March 25th.